Hi, it's Mickey, of course. And I'm talking about chapter 24 of Uta Hagen's Respect for Acting. This chapter talks about how you can't just focus on your relationships with others in a play, but also your relationship to the play as a whole and every object on stage. Everything should have meaning, and it should relate to you and your character in some way. There's a quote from this chapter that says, "The smallest inanimate object on stage must be made particular and personal by endowing it with the required physical and emotional properties." And I think that's a really nice thing to talk about, because we've talked about similar things in class, where we had discussions about finding an object that reminds you of a certain memory and that can cause an emotion to come out. So you don't just have to pretend that this is happening to you in this moment. You can find an object like washing up on shore, like we've talked about in class. Another quote from this chapter is, "Determine your character's relationship to the theme of the play." And that's something I found very interesting when I was reading this chapter, because I feel like I haven't necessarily thought about that before. Like, of course, you think about how your character relates to the play, what they do in the play, and how they move the plot along, like what's important, how they relate to other actors and characters. Obviously, you've thought about that. But I feel like I don't often think about how they relate to the theme of the play. So I'd be curious to ask everybody if they've ever thought of that, or if they can think now how maybe their characters and their scenes can relate to the theme of the play specifically. This chapter also talks about how in every relationship there's a dominant force and a submissive force. So you need to determine which your character is. You can determine when it is one or the other, where they are, when they're feeling one or the other, who they're with. Like, which characters do they take the lead, and which characters do they sit back and follow? Or maybe when they're at the workplace, they follow, but when they're at home, they lead. Different things like that, and really determining how that affects your character. A quote that relates to this as well is, always ask if it's reciprocal or if you are at opposites. So when it comes to those characters and your dynamics with them, seeing, do we agree on this certain fact or disagree, and why is that? Where does it come from? How long have you been feeling that way? Another thing that this chapter talks about is delving deeper into certain agreements, like we just talked about with characters and how it feels to another. Like, what leads to those? What's the reasoning? How far back does it go? Why is your character feeling a certain way? It brings up in the chapter something very interesting, talk about Romeo and Juliet, where it's love at first sight, sparks fly. But why do the sparks fly, and what causes those sparks to fly? Like, what is it about the other person that causes it to be love at first sight? And I think that's very interesting, because I feel like a lot of the times I just think, well, yeah, they're in love. They see each other, they're in love. But why is a very interesting question to ask. It also talks about your relationship to your own character. It talks about this when it speaks about like villains and how you can't judge your character. You need to be in like this true state of believing that your character is doing everything that is necessary for your character. You can't go in thinking, oh, well, this person is in the wrong, they're the villain, they're the bad guy, that's what I'm playing. Because then you're not playing them, because they believe that they're in the right in some way. Uta also talks about how youth reeks on stage and how it can be difficult to play older or younger, and also that it's rarely done in the professional world. She talks about how you can play yourself in situations and relationships based on like who you're around and how that can impact your age. And this is where it comes to my exercise to close out my discussion, is I would ask two people to stand up and talk to each other just normally how they would their student to student dynamic, have a conversation where they're introducing themselves to each other. Then you'd stop, and then I'd ask for them to think about meeting someone new for the first time, somebody who's maybe just coming into school, somebody who they've never seen before a day in their lives, and how that would change. Then doing it again and thinking about meeting your favorite celebrity, again, your least favorite politician, again, your parents' co-workers, and then see how that's changed just in general, how you act, and even your maturity level, and how you're not necessarily acting a different age because you're just acting as yourself. You're your age, but it gives a different vibe of age because of your relationships with other people. And I think that's a very interesting thing, especially because we're in educational theater right now and in our journey where we are going to have to play characters of different ages. And I think that'll help us so we don't fall into the trap of just playing a child or just playing an old person and not truly feeling that character. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed my chapter 24 discussion. Thank you for sitting and watching. Wish I could have done this with you in person, but as you can see, tech and opening, it's taken a lot out of us. So thank you guys so much. Hope you have a great rest of your week.